Hello, my name's Julie McCrossan, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second of the debates. Médecins, Frontières each week are bringing you a discussion on a major issue connected to their work. And today we're talking about responding to disasters. How can we improve it? And what are some of the sensitive and difficult debates and challenges that this community is dealing with? And I've got four people who are passionately involved in this issue. It's my great pleasure to welcome, first of all, Kate Gracie. She's a Médecins Sans Frontières field worker, an environmental engineer by background, and she's worked in 12 countries with MSF, including experience with tsunamis. So welcome to Kate. I'd also like to welcome Penny Harrison, who's Assistant Director with International Programs at Oxfam Australia. She has global experience, but particularly in Southeast Asia. And she's worked with Red Cross and MSF as well, so welcome to you. And welcome to Catherine Walker. She's First Assistant Director General with AusAid. She's their humanitarian coordinator, and she also has over 20 years experience globally, including on the ground in East Timor and the Solomons. And finally, my fourth guest to talk about responding to disasters is Anne Taylor. And Anne is from Médecins Sans Frontières. She's a regional emergency coordinator in the Asia-Pacific region, a builder originally, and she has experience globally in many countries. So welcome to all of you. Look, I want to kick off by giving people a sense of how people on the ground are affected when a disaster hits and some of the big challenges that you're commonly faced with. I might come to you, Kate, first, because you're a field worker. You've been on the ground in 12 countries. Can you give us an example of one or two disasters you've been involved in and the impact on the people and the immediate issues you faced?
Well, most of my experiences in natural disaster are with tsunamis. And what I notice first when I go in there, while my background is water and sanitation, I see that the impact on the population is that profound fear. A lot of these communities live by the water. They come from coastal communities, and their livelihood is often made from the sea. And then it's as though the sea has turned against them, and then they're actually fearful of the environment that has actually sustained them. And that you see this really profound impact and fear where they've had to move into inland away from the environment that has meant so much to them, and it's turned their world upside down, literally and metaphorically.
It's so interesting that you go to fear, not even unclean water, not even medical needs, not even infrastructure. You know, you're an engineer, but it's an emotional, psychological need.
Absolutely.
In your experience, what's the single most important thing that might address that fear?
It's giving them some sense of security and safety, and establishing maybe some sense of routine and procedure that gives them some sense of stability after that major event. And in terms of meeting their physical needs, for me as an environmental engineer, is meeting their needs for safe drinking water in sufficient quantity. That's, for me, is the number one where I come in.
Just before I leave you, you say you've had experience with a number of tsunamis. My goodness me. Where?
My first one was in Aceh, the massive tsunami that hit. When was that? That must have been about 10 years ago on, was it Boxing Day?
Yeah.
That was my first experience with a tsunami, and that was a sort of a baptism of fire because it was just enormous. And then after that, I responded to the tsunami in Samoa and the tsunami that hit the Mentawai Islands off the coast of Sumatra.
Amazing. Look, Penny Harrison, I'll come to you from Oxfam. Yeah, your experience of disasters, a couple of examples, and that immediate impact on the people.
Well, I mean, there's one that's happening right now, which is in Pakistan, and it's recurrent flooding. This is 3 years of ongoing flooding, and what we first see and what we're hearing from our staff is communities and our existing partners, they are typically the first responders, and they're always there and they're present. And it's always, I think, incredibly important not to lose sight of the fact that by the time anyone else arrives at a disaster, actually many people have already begun organising themselves. They've sorted where they can find shelter, they've tried to move people into medical facilities, they've tried to look at ways to organise themselves. And it's incredibly important that we don't forget that. But like you've said, I think critically, provision of water and safe water is absolutely fundamental, as much as also getting food.
You know, the driving desire of this is always how we're going to improve, and it sounds like when non-government organisations such as are represented around this table as well as government, when you come in, one of your major goals must be not to disrupt what's already going on.
That's right. It's about adding to, and it's about understanding how the system in that particular context works. And I'm sure all of us have had different experiences of seeing how that system works, and by that I mean how is local organisations working, how are local government, how are national government, how are United Nations, how are other international NGOs all working. In mega disasters like this, that's often the sort of scenario you're faced with. But of course, I think the other thing to not forget is that there are many small disasters all the time that don't hit the media. So in Tajikistan, for example, where I worked, landslides every season after the snow would hit villages, low-lying areas, you know, ultimately deaths every year. So looking at sorts of methods that are really going to help them, sometimes just very, very practical things, which could be around, you know, how their shelter is constructed, but it could also just be understanding what the risks and hazards are around their environment, and then how we can work with them to prevent that in future.
You mentioned the media and disasters don't get coverage. In your view, is the media a help or a hindrance when you're trying to improve a response to a disaster?
Well, I think it can be both. And I think
Can you give me examples?
I think it depends on the sorts of stories that you're also trying to elicit, and how ready we can make that connection with all of us as human beings. I think, like you've mentioned, you often see shock in people's faces. You know, these sorts of disasters are very profound. People who have lost relatives, other loved ones, they've been separated from their community, sometimes they've been moved already to another location, they're away from their livelihoods, but they're also away from their home and their coping units. So, you know, how we are able to explain that it is a very profound moment. Things don't happen also, you know, just overnight. We have to think through very carefully with those communities what their needs are and how we can best help them.
Catherine from AusAid, a couple of examples of disasters you've been involved in and the immediate impact on people. Can you paint us a picture?
Well, our job in AusAid is to coordinate the Australian government's response to natural disasters in developing countries. And perhaps I can pick up on the example of the tsunami in Samoa and Tonga back in 2009. We had an established Australian mission on the ground. We had AusAid staff already on the ground. We had all of the relationships that are necessary with the partner government and with local NGOs and church organisations. So in a sense, that made our job in Canberra easier because we had some really quick information about what kinds of needs we needed to address. And then we swung into action and we tried to address those needs as quickly as we could, including with support from New Zealand and with France under an agreement we have in responding to Pacific Island countries. And we had aircraft in there with the necessary personnel and supplies very quickly. In fact, they left on the first night after the tsunami struck. And I think at its peak we had something like 114 Australian civilians in Samoa, from search and rescue, from medical personnel, logisticians and so on, all responding to that emergency.
As I listen to all of you, what strikes me is just how many people are involved, how many organisations. How significant an issue is leadership and coordination in your view, and is it the issue?
I certainly think it's a very critical issue, and it's one that Australia is trying to highlight through our support for the UN's Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. That's the peak UN body responsible for coordination of humanitarian assistance. And certainly I think after the Indian Ocean tsunami, we had the opportunity as an international community to reflect on what worked well and what needed improvement. And I think this issue of leadership, very closely linked to coordination, is one of the things that we still need to work on.
Well, I've been obviously preparing for this, and I've read quite a bit of critique where people say too much coordination can suppress local innovation, that some parts of the population may miss out because they don't fit into the guidelines that the UN, for example, may have. If I can come to Anne Taylor, you're a Médecins Sans Frontières regional emergency coordinator, so you're into coordination. Your experience of the pros and cons of centralised coordination.
I think that this is not a centralised coordination position, but it's a relatively new one that we've developed in the Asia-Pacific region, because we recognise that it's necessary to have that coordination, because we're planning for the unplanned, and it's actually being able to. I mean, we're an organisation that wants to be in there within 24 hours, 48 hours, and certainly within the first 72 hours, which is so important in an emergency. So this coordinate, and it's always a mixture of working with the governments, the central governments, with the regional, with the ministries of health and so on and so forth. So we have to have some sort of mechanism to be able to get in quickly if we're not actually working in that particular country already. So this is part of my job, is to make sure that we have access, and that if we think that there, I mean, maybe major or maybe a smaller emergency, but whatever, that we're managing to get in there, we're doing assessments, or we're actually being able to move in and do something within that very, very short time span.
Can you give me a couple of examples of disasters that you've been involved in coordinating help to, and some of the hardest issues that arise for you as someone trying to coordinate?
I mean, in terms of actually coordination, in this part of the world, this is a new position. So it's really learning from some of the coordination situations that we've found ourselves in Haiti, for example, you know, in Banda Aceh, and even just recently in Japan, because we have an office in Japan, and when the tsunami struck, we actually sent assessment groups, and they worked down there. So we worked in with the defence, you know, the military defence forces there, the local, the civilian agencies within that area. So this is all part of our learning experience too, of how, because every disaster has a different element to it, and it's, you know, that a tsunami is quite different from an earthquake, different from a flood.
Why? Give me an example. Why are they different?
Well, for example, I mean, we can use Japan for examples, that they have extremely good earthquake resistant buildings, but with the tsunami, it was catastrophic, and it's very difficult to plan for that type of thing, and it happened very quickly, and even with all the excellent potential responses put in place, that was all completely wiped out. Regional government, you know, their own civil defence was wiped out in that particular region.
You've raised a very interesting point, and that is the nature of the society which is affected by the disaster can have a huge impact on what the people experience. People are able to, through hashtag MSF TV, send us questions, and also through the Facebook site. And we had a question from Kay, who says that she was in San Francisco on a number of occasions when earthquakes happened, some of them quite serious, but because of the really strict building codes and the constant public information and preparation for earthquakes, there were not deaths experienced. Whereas we had a nurse from Médecins Sans Frontières who was involved in Haiti respond to Kay's comment on Facebook, saying that she was in Haiti for the 2010 earthquake, and the buildings went down like packs of cards, and she lost to death a friend, a sister and a niece. Could you just tell us, any one of you, tell us some of your different experiences with different societies that lead to very different results for the people? Because it goes to preparation before an event, doesn't it? Perhaps you'd like to kick off.
Well, I'm thinking about the experience in after the West Sumatra earthquake, where numbers of buildings were levelled and people were killed, but it was also the case that some buildings were left standing, including a number of schools that Australia had helped to build. And we also supported the Indonesian government to do an engineering assessment of why it was that certain buildings had survived and people had therefore survived and why others had collapsed. And of course it does go in part to the kind of structures people are building,
Yes.
and the type of materials they use. So after the Padang earthquake, there was a big public awareness campaign in the local community to say, if you're building back what you have lost, you should strive to build back better. And that's a phrase that you hear around quite a lot. You should use different building materials and different methods of construction, and here's a whole lot of information about how to do that. Of course, one of the keys to that is to train the construction industry, the people who are going to build houses, in those better techniques and better building materials. But there are ways that you can minimise the risk to people.
Look, thank you. Can I have an example from you as an engineer of where you've seen different levels of impact on populations, and what can be done to try and prevent that in the future?
Well, you see, often I think in the smaller communities, like rural communities, often the type of buildings aren't affected so much. So there's often these simpler rural communities where you think, which don't have such solid housing, they actually fare much better in an earthquake.
Okay, an example?
Oh, I suppose earthen buildings with thatch roofs. They don't crumple like an urban building that's made out of concrete, which seems to be a stronger building but has a much greater catastrophic effect when an earthquake hits. So it's often those urban settings which seem to be much more developed, which actually fare much worse in an earthquake.
So if we're going to improve our response, is it partly about building codes? Your experience of the differential impact of disasters and how we can improve our response through preparation?
Well, obviously, building codes. I mean, it's really this is a central government. This is a government. This is a country. Countries have to be committed to the idea of having strong building codes and earthquake controls. As Kate says, is that it depends a little bit on the type of building as well. I mean, often the residential buildings that are made out of wood and so on do reasonably well in earthquake situations, for example. But as soon as you start getting into first floor, second floor buildings, building up, usually then people are moving into other type of materials, and unless they're really well reinforced and a lot of principles are put in place, and these are the buildings actually that cause the deaths. And so these are the buildings that the governments really and the building industry have a responsibility around.
Is Oxfam got a view on this? What more can be done to in sort of primary prevention, I suppose we're talking about?
I was going to say, to perhaps shift to some other examples. I think what we know from our practice is that investing in risk reduction, or as we are currently terming it, resilience strategies, which really means what do we understand is going on for that particular community in terms of their access to livelihoods, in terms of water, in terms of a whole range of other sorts of risks and hazards that they might be facing with, for example, recurrent disasters. And we know that if we invest up front, it's the handle is something like, if we put $1 into disaster risk reduction, we will reduce the cost in terms of the sorts of scale of response that we need by several dollars more. So it's very cost effective, but it's actually incredibly effective in helping communities build resilience to cope. So we've seen, for example, in the recent crises in the Horn of Africa, but also West and Central Africa, because communities have not had the chance to recover, their livestock has been impacted, their access to food therefore has been impacted, in many cases women in particular. But we've also seen some initiatives, let's say, of governments in Ethiopia, in Somalia even, where they're trying to look at how do we work with women pastoralists, what do we do to put in place home gardens, to build different forms of nutrition and nutrition awareness, how do we help communities manage livestock so that in times of disaster we supplementary feed livestock or we vaccinate livestock to give that community a better chance of seeing through those peaks and troughs. So
one thing I'm learning here is that responding better to disasters is not just about what happens when a disaster hits. I want to take us through a number of other areas where I gather there are constant debates within your community when it comes to improving disasters. And one of them is the role of the military. And you've recently, I think, been in Tokyo, where you met with military representatives from 22 different countries to discuss responding to disasters. What are the pros and cons of using the military? What are some of the sensitivities?
Well, this was an initiative by the Japanese the ground defence forces, and it was really in recognition of the fact that well, firstly we have to recognise two in these major disasters that it's the military that go in, and they're often having to, they're doing the search and rescue, they're often taking the bodies out, they've usually got that logistic mechanism behind them to do a lot.
And they've got big machinery.
Big machine. But they've also had to recognise too that they must work in with civilians, which of course is NGOs and others, and also they are taking they're having to report also to the government, central government, regional government as well. So it's part of it is to do with coordination, and they've recognised, and we also have to recognise too, and because it does impact on us if we have problems getting in the first 24 hours or 48 hours, because they're military in there and they're controlling the zone. So we have to have some sort of way of working together and recognising and respecting each other's roles in this type of.
This must be highly sensitive in some countries where the relationship between the population and the military is tough. What's your thoughts on this?
It is an interesting point, because I think a lot of our terms of reference has been, particularly with MSF, our terms of reference historically has been, say, the European military and their relationship with Africa is very, very different to our military's relationship with, say, the Pacific. And so we've often, I think, used that as our model, but it's such a different situation, the European and African relationships between military and those countries. I think in the Pacific, our relationship is quite unique. When I was in Samoa, I saw the New Zealand Defence Force working with Samoa, who I think they did a remarkable job. They have, I think the relationship of the New Zealand Defence Force in the Pacific is quite a very benevolent one. There's very much a cultural familiarity. There's a lot of, say, Samoan troops in the New Zealand Defence Force. And when I was talking to one of those New Zealand Defence Force members, and he said at the time that they hadn't fired a shot in anger for decades. So it's a really different, they have a very different perception.
Whereas I'm assuming the European military have, through a historic period, have intervened in Africa in a way that's controversial.
Very controversial and very hardcore. So it's a very different model here, and I think it needs to be taken case by case.
Your thoughts on the military?
Yeah, I think very much on a case-by-case basis, and very much to ensure that really the primacy is a humanitarian imperative. And really what we mean by that is ensuring that when we're working with communities, we're responding to their needs. We're not responding to a political agenda. And that's something that we have to keep forefront in our minds. And I think there are situations, and I think we all know the logistic difficulties of moving around the Pacific. There are very few instruments available to mobilise resources and move people and goods quickly. And that is particularly unique in that setting.
So the military are a tool that you need. I mean, this is a little bit linked to the issue of the politicisation of aid and whether it can ever be legitimately used for a political purpose. And as you're an AusAid public servant, I'm going to come to you, but I want to read a couple of quotes. A UN Special Envoy for Assistance to Pakistan appealed for more aid by saying we need to pacify some of the most volatile parts of Pakistan. And Senator John Kerry argued for an increase in US aid to Pakistan by saying there's obviously a national security interest. We do not want additional jihadis, extremists coming out of the crisis. Well, both of them seem to imply give us some aid so we don't have trouble with these people. Is it clearly a kind of security purpose? Is that legitimate?
I think that those comments came out of the either the Pakistan floods or the large-scale displacement of people around the border areas in Pakistan, and I think they were at their heart saying, you know, it is important to get humanitarian assistance to these populations, however difficult it is to reach it, it is still important. And I think that's around the humanitarian imperative, that that aid is delivered to all people who need it, wherever they are. But from the Australian government's perspective, I guess in terms of natural disasters, I'd use the national interest argument.
What does that mean?
Well, clearly it's in Australia's national interest to respond to natural disasters in our immediate region, in the Pacific Island, Indonesia, East Timor and our other Southeast Asian neighbours.
In the sense that you want a stable population, a stable...
It's about doing the right thing. they will help us when we need their assistance. Okay. And we've seen that in terms of the Queensland floods and the Victorian bushfires. So it's part of reciprocity. It's also...
So it's sort of love your neighbour, but it's also help them so they'll help you. It's sort of self-interest and love your neighbour.
I don't think that the Australian community would want the Australian government to sit back and not respond to natural disasters that are affecting countries in our immediate region. And in fact, the Australian community has shown that it also wants the government to respond to disasters that are much further afield. And if you look at the Australian community response to the Haiti earthquake, something like $26 million raised by the Australian public, more than the government provided by a couple of $1 million.
So there's just plain evidence the population want to help.
Yes.
Okay. Your thoughts on politics and aid and whether those two things are ever problematic?
Well, I think more to the point is, again, what is the imperative in terms of the response and the needs? And I think the question that we would always come back to as Oxfam first and foremost is, how do we ensure that we are working with those communities to do that? The question of politics becomes secondary or third. Of course, we have to understand what's going on within that environment. But I think organisations like ours are very much set up to work with those communities. Now, what we also know, though, is to be most effective, we have to cooperate, as we've discussed before, with a whole range of actors. And in particular, for example, some of our work in West Sumatra in Indonesia, where we've got a whole so-called building resilience program. And really what that means is that we're working with communities across 16 provinces, trying to understand what their risks and hazards are, enabling everyday members of your average village to be able to sit down with their government representatives and talk about what their needs are, discuss the sorts of costs that it's going to take to ensure that those communities become better able to cope with the shocks that will come in future, where we know that they have recurrent flooding, drought and so on, sort of those most disaster prone. So a part of our role, I think, is to help facilitate some of that dialogue and offer up ideas and learning from practice elsewhere. So, for example, we know in Bangladesh, between the cyclone event in 1991 and 2007, it's very well talked about, but there was many different levels of response, including from the Bangladesh government, including from international governments, including from the non-government sector within and outside of the country, that has resulted in a dramatic drop in the number of deaths. Now, the reason for that is because we've all built very good early warning systems. We've looked at questions of livelihoods, and that's had to be done together. But it has taken a number of years to get to that point. These things aren't just going to be fixed overnight.
I guess we have a few minutes left, and I want to go to this question of accountability, whether it's Médecins Sans Frontières or Oxfam or AusAid. When you go in and work, to whom are you accountable for what you do and how you spend your money and the results you must achieve, you manage to achieve, and who do you report to? Can I come to you?
Well, I mean, first out, just going back a little bit, because it links in a little bit to your last question too, is that I mean, with MSF we have always tried to minimise our institutional funding, for example, because of this whole business of politicisation.
What does institutional funding mean?
Well, to take money from governments, from particular institutions that might have strings attached to that money. They want us to work with this community rather than that community, or to do this rather than that. Okay. We've always really tried to avoid that. So we've always tried to stay as independent. It's one of the very big parts of our charter, and so we have always our money, comes from our donations come from the public. Okay. So at large.
And so therefore, are you predominantly accountable both to the people you're serving and the people who donate?
Exactly, both. Yeah. Both. It's the beneficiaries, the recipients, and the people that give us the money. But so we really try and guard that. I think that obviously there are certain countries and certain situations where it's much that part is extremely important, and other particular areas is not quite.
And just to give us a sense of how you report back to the local population, because obviously you're reporting back in a way with MSF TV and newsletters and so on. So how do you report to the local people for the work you've done? Account to them.
Right. I think that I mean, firstly, there are the authorities. You know, that we preach produce reports. We produce annual reports. We produce along the normal types of lines of accountability. We can be audited too. We get audited from time to time. We also, I mean, part of even what we're doing today is talking about how we're working and so on, for people to understand, what we're trying to do and what we want to do, and how, and to work within our charter and because we always will be working towards looking at populations in distress. That is our absolute our key point, is to make sure that we're always working towards being able to respond as fast as possible to populations in distress.
Penny, you're working for Oxfam now, but you've also worked for Red Cross and MSF. So what's the biggest lesson you've learnt about accountability and how to do it well?
We often pay due regard to approaches which ensure that a whole range of community members, and particularly women and people who are really vulnerable in these sorts of disaster situations, are able to be involved in the sorts of decisions in terms of the activities that they want to be involved in. And then it's about really employing methods that not only you have those conversations in a way that elicits what those needs are, but then that you are demonstrating through the decision making that involves them what you're going to do. So in the east of Sri Lanka, for example, particularly involving women in home gardening initiatives as a part of rebuilding livelihoods after recurrent flooding, let alone multiple displacements of conflict over time. Their needs are shifting and changing. But also we do other things, like I think many others. We publish lots of external reports, but for example, we've done a recent report called Dangerous Delay, which looked at the situation in the Horn of Africa. And what we're saying is that our lesson from that is that we need to better manage uncertainty. We're all very used to working with pretty hard facts and figures, but actually many of these sorts of crises, we know that the triggers are there, and we have to get better at managing with the uncertainty and working with forecasts and figures which begin to give us triggers and indicators of what's happening. Now, we need to be discussing that with community members. We need to be involving them in understanding, well, if we start to see those triggers from a livelihoods perspective, how can we work with you, let's say your animals, what can we do to better prepare you to manage if that shock comes, if the rains fail in another 6 months' time.
One of the things I've learned from listening to you just then is accountability isn't just telling people this is what we did to you. It's working with people fundamentally and involving them in decisions. You want to talk about ambiguity, don't you? Because you're talking about uncertainty. We only have a moment left, but what have you learnt about accountability, and where does ambiguity fit into that?
Well, I think our accountability framework is very similar. First and foremost, to the people we are trying to help with Australian government assistance. And we do that in a number of very similar ways, particularly around consultation with communities. But we also give a lot of money to our partners, like the UN, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, Australian NGOs and so on. And we demand accountability from our partners as well. We want to achieve results on the ground.
And is part of your role to convince Australians to up the amount of money we spend on developing countries? I mean, I know that's a really political thing to say to you, and you're a public servant, but I mean, surely that would reflect the passion of the Australian people who donate so much, as you said earlier.
Well, the Australian government has committed to increase our aid budget overall, so we are in a growth phase, and that of course does reflect Australian community values and concerns, and they're most obviously demonstrated when crises hit. But there are many Australians who are supporters of longer term development, and I think the one thing I've learnt is that you really do need to integrate recovery and longer term development programming as soon as you can in a humanitarian response.
And that's where the area for improvement lies for you, in leadership in that?
Well, certainly I think there's an area for improvement in leadership of the emergency response phase, and then I think there's definitely leadership required in terms of how you quickly integrate recovery and reconstruction and longer term development programming.
And is the national government of the country you're entering critical in that leadership role?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they are in the driver's seat. They are responsible for the development of their own country.
So keeping good relationships with governments in advance of disasters must be critical.
But there are occasions, and Haiti's a very good one, where, the government was all but wiped out by an earthquake that wiped out the capital. So in countries where you have very weak government, many of us have to look for other partners, and that can be provincial government, it can be district government, it can be, you know, national organisations. So it's not always, governments can be rapidly overwhelmed themselves by disasters.
Yeah. Look, Kate, a final comment to you. I know you're a field worker with Médecins Sans Frontières, so you're been on the ground in 12 countries. How do you view accountability back to the people you're working with?
Well, one thing that I do really like about MSF is that we are very critical of ourselves, and we do often engage we hold regular forums, whether it's in our own sections, in our own countries, or on international forums, and we thrash stuff out, and we point fingers at each other, and and I think that's really healthy. Is that we enter into a lot of debate, and we accuse each other of all kinds of things, and
the body language.
And we are hypercritical of each other, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. So, okay, so self-criticism and sharing in times like this.
Yeah.
Look, our time is up, but I just want to, on behalf of our audience, thank our 4 guests for a lively discussion about responding to disasters and a sense of the complexity you face, but also some of the areas for improvement. And I guess one of the things I'll really take away from it is this notion of building resilience, or this notion of triggers and anticipating, and the work that you do beforehand and after in relation to building codes and so on, is that can be almost as important as that immediate response, that they're both critical. So on behalf of our audience, thank you to our panel, and we'd love to hear more of your questions or comments. You can go to Facebook or hashtag MSFTV. My name's Julie McCrossan. We're going to have 2 more weeks with you with these panels and all the other things that are happening on MSFTV. We're talking about neglected people in our panel discussion next week, and following that, armed conflict. So I hope you can join us. Bye-bye from me, Julie McCrossan.